Okay, I think we'll make a start, and I'd like to welcome everyone here this morning. This is the final conference of a British Academy project on ethical advice, ethics committees in the pandemic, which I and Emma Cave have been the co-investigators on, with Mariana Ditborn as our invaluable administrator, and we have run this project by a series of webinars addressing particular issues and topics that arise. And with a certain degree of continuity, people who have previously been the webinars are now reappearing for some final thoughts and a bringing together of some of the issues that have arisen during the process of the project. I suppose technically, just you'll note that this is being recorded. We have a small number of speakers in each half today, with a panelist who will comment after we've heard from the speakers, and our intent is to run this very much as a conversation. I see David King has joined us, and I know, David, that you are actually having to leave shortly, if that's right.
Yeah.
And I thought, with the agreement of others, that it would be good to give you the floor for 5 minutes before you have to go, since we are at that curious point of perhaps talking about the end of the pandemic. And to those who are not aware, Sir David King is a previous Chief Scientific Officer, but he has also chaired Independent SAGE, which has regularly commented during the course of the pandemic on various matters. So I wondered, David, if you wanted to open this conference with any comments, as we are at a particularly interesting juncture in terms of the pandemic.
Dave, thank you very much. And I think what I would like to start with, you mentioned that I was Chief Scientific Advisor. When I became Chief Scientific Advisor, I almost immediately had the Phillips Commission report into the BSE crisis in Britain. And the Phillips Commission report, if you like, became the Bible for my actions as Chief Scientific Advisor, because what Phillips said was what went wrong during the BSE crisis was the ability of the Minister for Agriculture to say, I'm following science advice, but no scientist was out there in the public domain saying what the advice was. And it turned out that the scientists were not giving the advice that the minister was claiming they were giving. And this was all discovered by the Phillips Commission. And effectively, they were advising that eating British beef was perfectly safe at that time. And then, of course, there was the discovery that people were dying from variant form of the same brain disease as BSE in cattle. And so the Phillips Commission report said chief scientific advisors should be appointed in each government department. And this was not the case before. People just rose through the civil service system. There was a chief scientific advisor in the Department of Defense and also in the Prime Minister's office. And in the Prime Minister's office, I was able to say we must appoint chief scientific advisors in every government department, and that has now happened. And these are people mostly parachuted in from the university sector and provide a bridge between current research in the university sector and government. And up to 2010, we chief scientific advisors were allowed to go into the public domain and tell the public what our advice was to the government. And that was a key because it was a means of keeping the trust of the public and keeping the trust of the cabinet. And everyone had to remember that you had to keep the trust of both. And that was not ever an easy challenge. But nevertheless, in 2010, that was changed. And when I rejoined government under both Cameron and May, it meant that I was never allowed on television or radio without being totally briefed on what I would say. This was completely contrary to what the Phillips Commission report said. And I believe that is still in place today. And so that's my first comment, that if we want an open, honest discussion about what the advice is into the government, we need to return to giving chief scientific advisors that position. So my second point is just to deal with the current state of the crisis in the United Kingdom, where we have 35,000, roughly speaking, new cases per day of COVID-19, and this is rising. And although the doubling period is extending, it was at 9 days, it's taking longer. And I'm sure this is due to two things: the rise in the vaccination levels and also the rise in immunity from people who've had the disease. And that's particularly true of the younger group of people in the country. So I think the current state of the government's policy is not really being discussed in terms of herd immunity and amongst the younger people, but I do believe that must be the policy. There's no other way of discussing rationally how the government is making decisions. And if we are following herd immunity, it's not new. I believe it was followed in February, March last year as well, until we went into the first lockdown. So if we are following herd immunity, I would like to see it up for public discussion, that we are allowing people under the age of 18 to get the disease in order to become immune. But of course, when younger people get the disease, there is the possibility of them getting long COVID. It's a low possibility. But more worrying is the percentage of young people who have the disease, the density of the virus in the country, and the possibility that yet another mutation of the disease will take hold in this country and have an even higher transmissibility, for example. It might even not be handled by the current vaccine program. So I think we are running risks with the current policy, but most particularly, I want to argue for a public debate engaging with the chief scientific advisors who are putting advice in, so that we know exactly what the form of the advice is.
Thank you very much indeed, David. That was very helpful and very stimulating. And I think it provides an interesting immediate backdrop to the discussions we'll have today. I'm going to turn now to the themes of the first half of the day, which are about national ethics guidance and advice during a pandemic. And amongst the questions that have been broached during the project are whether we need a national ethics committee, whether we need national ethics guidance, what we might mean by ethical preparedness for a pandemic. If we do have guidelines, what's their proper provenance and source? Are they to be issued top-down, or are we going to use a kind of principle of subsidiarity and devolve ethical decision-making to relevant domains? And what are the key values and principles that should operate when we offer such guidance? We have two great speakers who are returning to this project, and they are going to be first Sir Jonathan Montgomery, who has far too many existing titles and jobs for me to now list. But of most relevance, perhaps, is that he was my immediate predecessor as the chair of the National Council on Bioethics, which is often referred to as the UK's National Ethics Committee, and also is currently co-chair of NEAG, which is the official moral and ethical advisory group providing independent advice to the government on ethical and faith-related issues to do with health and social care. And I'll introduce our second speaker after Jonathan, but we have agreed, I think, that each, since they're addressing roughly the same area of concern, will speak in turn without too much space for immediate questioning after each, so that we can maximize the time for panel discussion and general discussion. So each will speak for about 20 minutes. And over, first of all, to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Dave, and good morning to everyone. I'm hoping you're now seeing a slide that's headed Ethical Advice During COVID-19. And I'm going to talk about three challenges, which, if you like, I'll perspectives, and I'm going to try and illustrate it with 3 particular bits of ethical advice that I've been involved in during the pandemic. I must say that although I'm drawing on my experiences of co-chairing of MEAG and also chairing the Ethics Advisory Board to the NHS X contact tracing app project, the very first one, the one that wasn't implemented, of course, everything I say is my own fault and my own responsibility, and I can't bind them into it. So my 3 challenges are challenges about method, how we should go about doing ethical advice during the pandemic. And fundamentally, I think we've explored elements of how much we can get involved in principled deliberation and how much ethical advice is much more pragmatic and focused on particular sorts of problems. Secondly, I think we've found a new set of challenges around legitimacy, who is entitled to give advice in these areas. And there are lots of aspects of that, but there are a couple that I will come back to. One is around the clashes of paradigm. Is this advice primarily about something focused on bioethics, or is this just politics at work? And depending on where you place things on that, you may come up with some different issues around who you look to have the right to speak on those questions. So what you might call the jurisdiction to give ethical advice. And then there's an element of the right to speak, which is about what is done in the public domain and what is done behind closed doors. And I want to try and illustrate some of those questions. And then the third challenge is all about what difference context makes. So we've found ourselves taking decisions very quickly, and we found ourselves taking decisions without it being entirely clear who decision makers are and how they're approaching their decision making. We've got some ethical advice, which is what you might call embedded, and I'll try and illustrate that a bit later on. And we've had ethical advice that's much more in the public domain and independent. We're dealing with a context of considerable scientific uncertainty, and we've been giving this advice in the context of legal and political constraints. And I'll try and illustrate some of those challenges through talking about issues around contact tracing apps, issues around COVID certification and passports, and then briefly touch on some work I was involved with around critical care guidance. But I think we'll hear more about that from Dominic later on. So to put some context, I'm not going to talk about the work of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics because there are people here who can talk about that with more legitimacy. But a very helpful statement they put out in April 2020 about just the very basics of democratic governance in the context of pandemic, that would involve government showing us what they're doing, explaining the ethical approach behind it and how decisions are reached, doing so in an inclusive way with a broad range of voices to contribute and thinking ahead. And that's absolutely where I would have started before the pandemic and the idea of ethical preparedness. And it was what I was involved with back in 2007 when we were developing an ethical framework for policy and planning in preparation for pandemic influenza. And I'm sure we'll have lots of discussions about whether or not COVID is similar or dissimilar to a flu pandemic. And we came up with an ethical framework which is broadly represented in the diagram on the right-hand side of this slide, which is a slide from a conference I presented it at many years ago. And fundamentally, it's quite similar, but we can tease out differences to the sort of position that the Nuffield Council took about what would be good governance during COVID. Now, the successor to the group who drew up that set of principles, which was known as the Committee on the Ethical Aspects of Pandemic Influenza, has been the Moral and Ethical Advisory Group. But this is a subtly different group from groups I've sat on previously. And I just want to pull out a few characteristics of it and what it's done. First of all, it's quite a mixed group. So it's mixed professional bioethicists. It has people from the health professional regulators. It has leaders from various community groups, not exclusively faith communities, but predominantly faith communities. It hasn't produced any formal public-facing statements. What it did do very early on was to adopt the ethical framework that I've just shown you as a basis. But for England and for the UK, it hasn't managed to reissue a version of that which is COVID specific. Although interestingly, Wales has produced one based on that framework. Scotland has produced one based on that framework. But in MEAG, we were not able to reach an agreement on how we would tweak that in the timescale that seemed necessary to do it. And I'll come back to that point in a slightly different context in a moment. MEAG has had a lot of discussions early on. We met a couple of times a week, and then weekly, and then fortnightly, and now we are more driven by when government brings us issues. We've discussed a large number of things, and you can see on the MEAG meeting notes, which are on the MEAG part of the website, GHSC, issued about 6 months after the event, a sort of summary of what we've discussed, but you'll be hard pushed to work out much of the detail from those brief notes, and we can discuss perhaps that later on. But the sorts of things we've included quite early days discussions about COVID status certification. Civil servants came to us very early on, before there was any plan for COVID passports, just to talk about their thinking on some of the issues. We've looked at risk stratification shielding at a number of points. We did a lot of intense work on rituals around dying, including attendance at funerals, where we definitely influenced ministerial decision-making in terms of opening up attendance. And we've had discussions around various aspects of vaccines, including how to respond appropriately to various types of hesitancy. I think the characteristics of this is that the way MEAG has operated has been behind closed doors, which has had the advantage of enabling us to create a safe space for civil servants and others to come with early and confidential discussions, but the disadvantage of not enabling those to be transparent in the public domain. MEAG, because it's a mixed group of people with rather different disciplines and perspectives, has proved pretty good at explaining how difficult everything is and identifying issues, but not able really to crystallize into a set of recommendations. And that depends a lot on what you see the role of ethical advice as doing, whether you think that's a vice or a virtue. MEAG has navigated a sort of role between other bodies. So occasionally it's been called on to give specific advice at the request of groups. That's happened with the National Screening Committee, published advice informed by MEAG discussions. More often it's had to navigate what its job is in relation to other people who have had responsibility for calling decisions. So we've had some interactions with the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, the JCVI, but we haven't really been able to take a position on their views. We've tended to hear about what they're doing later rather than earlier. And some things haven't come to us at all. So we haven't had any debate about the ethics of human challenge trials, because that's been the remit of the Health Research Authority. But one of the key things that boils down to, I think, is that we've not been able to be clearly influential on very much, and we've certainly not been able to tell government what to do. On the plus side, that's made it very clear that we can't be used as a fig leaf to absolve decision makers of their ethical responsibility. And that was one of the principles behind the SIAPI document, that it shouldn't be used in a way that was algorithmic, that dictated conclusions. It should be raised to help people think through what was at stake and take on that responsibility themselves. So that's MEAG. And now let me pick three illustrations for you. The first is the Ethics Advisory Board to NHSX. And as I said earlier, this was set up to advise the initial project, the one that didn't work, the one that wasn't fundamentally implemented, the one that involved the ability of an app to gather some data on how it was operating, who was being alerted, which in my view had the major ethical advantage that it would enable us to work out what impact it has, whereas the app we have now, it's pretty hard to know who uses it and what it does. But my main set of points around this are around some of the learning about the process of giving ethics advice. And the first of those was, who were the relevant ethicists? We were dealing with data ethics, we were dealing with public health ethics, and we had to put together a group of people who could draw on a range of ethical traditions. And they had some overlap, some complementarities, but also some rather different flavors. Second characteristic of this is that we were set up to do a job embedded in a project. So as I took on that and tried to recruit people to join us, I was very clear with people that this was not the place where we could have a debate about the fundamental ethics of contact tracing apps. You needed to be at least prepared to explore the question of how to do it ethically, because we were being set up, we thought, for a job that would only take 2 or 3 weeks. And we didn't have the time or luxury to discuss those fundamental questions, and nor did we have the opportunity to explore whether a different sort of contact tracing app would be a good idea. Now, I'm not for a moment saying that those are not crucial ethical issues. I'm saying that the particular function of this group was a subset of the ethical issues that were there. The third thing to draw attention to is the fact that we had to operate conditionally. We were at an early stage in the process. We didn't really know what was going to work and what wasn't. There were pilot rollouts being done in order to explore those things. So that led us to frame our advice conditionally. So we set it up in terms of what would you need to show for this project to be ethically acceptable. And the final thing is that, and it's linked with that, was that meant that time was of the essence. So we met in early April and we delivered a letter to the Secretary of State on the 24th of April, explaining what we understood to be the key ethical questions and explaining how we expected those to be worked through, and including issues about governance into the future. Now, that letter didn't become public for about 5 weeks because of a convention which made some sense to me at the time, but raises some interesting challenges, that it would make sense to publish both the advice and the government's decision and rationale for that decision at the same time. But of course, that meant that we had a period where the public was crying out quite reasonably for reassurance that there was some ethical thinking going on when it looked as though nothing was happening. And the second thing about the timely advice was that we identified as a group that there was a key decision about whether to pivot from what sometimes described as the centralized approach to what sometimes described as the decentralized Apple-Google approach that we're now using. And we realized that there was a weekend in which it was almost certain that government would need to take that decision. And therefore, we decided on Thursday that I had to email on the Friday to the chief executive of NHSX to say, this is what we think needs to be taken into account when that decision is made. If we hadn't done that email on that particular day, we'd have lost our opportunity to have some influence. Now, that letter and those emails are now in the public domain as part of the report that we drafted on the work of the contact tracing app, so you can read them. So they did make it into the public domain, but not at the point at which they were aimed to have some purchase. So that was contact tracing. My second illustration is around the debates about COVID certification and passports. And this is clearly very complex. I just want to take you through sort of my journey in terms of ethics advice and what seemed to be going on to me. Now, early on, we had a reasonably theoretical debate. It came to MEAG extremely early. And I guess the main perception of the issue at that stage is that it would just look like a bad idea. It was bad science, it was bad politics, and it was bad science because it turned some complex assessments of people's risk to others and to themselves into something that looked like a binary question. Do you have the passport or not? It was divisive because it drew barriers between different bits of society, and it was discriminatory because that overlaid a number of other disadvantages that we had. So the first time I spoke about this, it was basically to explain what a nonsense idea it was. Later on, the key argument seemed to become one about, well, when should we think about this idea? If it was out there and people were thinking about it, was it useful to have that debate and give advice at this stage? And I found myself focusing at that point on at what point would enough of the population be able to qualify for some form of passport to make it a sensible tool in arguing about economic opening up. And broadly, I was arguing that it was not a summer 2021 issue, because we were not going to have enough people double vaccinated far enough in advance to deal with the question of school holidays or Reading Festival, I use an example. So that became incredibly pragmatic. I was sitting down with a spreadsheet, working out what the data was on how many people being vaccinated, calculating the number of weeks between the first vaccination and the second, and when that would mean they'd become eligible to a certificate, to try and persuade people that this was not something worth thinking about now because it wasn't going to solve the problem. And that was the key issue, I think, about vaccine passports, is that people couldn't really articulate what problem they were thought to solve. And until you could articulate that problem, you really couldn't give advice on how to do it. And you can also tell that story in terms of the shift of paradigms. So that felt like it started off as a bioethics issue. How does this relate to the science? It then became enmeshed in, well, if we all agree that we are trying to find a balance between public safety in terms of health and public well-being in terms of reopening society and the economy, how did it fit into that process? And then it became a bit of a sloganistic issue about, are we or are we not going to divide our society up? What does freedom mean? And you can see that in processes as well. The first talk I spoke about was a panel session at something called Coggon. The more detailed piece of work I became involved with an expert workshop around Ada Lovelace, trying to scope the range of issues. And then the internal politics of the Go review, trying to think how these ideas could be got into the political processes. It doesn't match those changes of paradigms, but it does show that there are lots of different spaces in which you need to try and have influence if you're trying to give ethical advice. And a lot of that is incredibly opportunistic. So we had an opportunity to give a 10-minute presentation at a civil service teach-in, which is a sort of Friday lunchtime update for members of civil servants. And I had the opportunity to feed in some of the things I'd heard from MEAG into that process. The most visible one is a paper that we wrote for the benefit of SAGE. It wasn't a formal MEAG paper, but it was informed by the MEAG discussions. It wasn't a formal MEAG paper, essentially, because we had about 48 hours to draft it, to get that opportunity. And 3 members of MEAG, myself, Robert Dingwall, and Mike Parker, took the view that we should take that opportunity because otherwise there would be no opportunity to feed in. But we couldn't take the risk of circulating anything for amendment because that would have meant we'd missed the boat. So you can now read that paper. It went to SAGE on the 9th of December and it was published on the 5th of July. And broadly, I just want to talk about the way in which the context influenced that paper being drafted. There had to be only 4 pages. It had to have no references, which is very different from what I'm used to. But just as interestingly, the advice was you have to focus on what is actually being contemplated. And fundamentally, what was being contemplated was driven by the practicalities of interventions. So you could test to see whether someone currently had the virus. You could test to see whether they'd had it previously and were immune after previous infection, sometimes called natural immunity. And you can find out whether they've had the intervention of vaccination. So we framed our advice around those things that were being seen as practical things that could be done of ethical significance. The second thing is that we thought of what we were doing with a very specific audience. So one of the members of that group advised, well, how do you want to influence these people, speak their language? And part of the language they spoke was in relation to degrees of scientific competence. So we talked about how high confidence would need to be in whether or not people who had previously had an infection were less likely to transmit the virus to others. And we framed our advice in terms of alternatives. If you had high confidence in these things, it might become ethical. If it was only low, it wouldn't. And then the third bit of framing is about the politics. And I put politics with a small p there, very deliberately, because in many ways, what we're really talking about here is the art of persuasion, the rhetoric of doing bioethics advice. So we started this with a case for doing it, not the case against it, because we were advised that was more likely to get traction. We tried to put down some markers by linking our advice back to that UK ethical framework, because we thought that's the appropriate way to give ethical advice, to try and root it in something principled. We tried to work out what we might get out of it. So we put in a line bidding for, you should always do equalities impact assessments before you implemented these things, because we thought that had a small chance, only a small, I'm afraid to say, chance of success. And I slipped in a sentence about if the government did this, it would be a bit like giving a license for Typhoid Mary, in the hope that that might give a soundbite opportunity to get some public debate going. Now, these are all, if you like, tricks of the trade to try and get some influence. They don't have much traction if something doesn't get published for 6 months, but they felt worth trying and a big part of the experience of dealing with it. And my third example, which I'll try and deal with briefly because I think Dominic will talk about some of the issues, is our attempt in March 2020 to pull together some national guidance on resource allocation, which, as the National Council on Bioethics pointed out in January of this year, was something we obviously should have attempted to try and produce. They said we needed something authoritative, clear, definite, robust, transparent, firm, credible, and consistent. Well, we had a good go at that. I had a very intense 2 or 3 weeks trying to deal with it. We had what I still think is an acceptable idea. We needed to try and produce a principled foundation. We needed to try and make sure that people didn't rush to triage when they didn't need to. So the document from the Intensive Care Society has a big part on the principles of mutual aid, how we made sure that different organisations checked they really needed to triage and they couldn't transfer patients. And we tried to find a sort of decision support tool to pull together the best available evidence, which was pretty poor at that stage, into something that could be used at 3 o'clock in the morning. Now, that founded as a public project. I was invited along with a couple of other people to work with MEAG on the ethics side to deal with that. And the plug got pulled because issuing national guidance on what you did when you ran out of critical care at the very point when they were explaining that they didn't think we would run out of critical care was something that was in conflict with the messaging. We didn't manage to produce a sort of MEAG consensus, and there were very good reasons for disagreeing about these issues. Fair innings arguments about people who are older, issues around multiple disadvantages and intersectionality, all very good things to discuss, but we had built everything around capacity to benefit. And also there were risks in terms of discrimination challenges, and there'd been judicial reviews for failing to issue this guidance, and judicial reviews threatened of this guidance, even though it wasn't issued. There is a really interesting context that we didn't anticipate back in 2007. So what are my reflections on this? Well, in terms of methods, we've got multiple different ways of giving advice, and we're not really very good at working out how to evaluate whether it's done well or badly. The big thing, which I've not touched on, but I think is crucial on this, is about public deliberation. Said King made this point. We didn't even try in the early stages of the pandemic. We now have some good public deliberative work around COVID care, intensive care triage. Could we have done that at the time? So there's something about how far do we really need to go from our traditional forms of advice. On legitimacy, we need to work out particularly the interaction within politics and bioethical legitimacy. Is COVID ethics similar to the sorts of ethics we've been used to? Or actually, is it perfectly reasonable for politicians to take these decisions and we just sit on the sidelines offering advice, but we're not core to it? And finally, in terms of context, I've tried to describe how we took advantages of opportunities that were there. And I'm not at all ashamed of being opportunistic, but it does raise a really significant challenge about how you can be confident that when you're being opportunistic, you're not losing your integrity. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. I thought that was a wonderfully clear and comprehensive review of your own experience of providing ethical advice in an extremely difficult context and some of the lessons learned. I don't see any open questions from our attendees, and we had said that we would run on into Dominic's talk. Perhaps I could abuse chair's privilege and just say it seemed to me that one of the interesting issues you raised there, Jonathan, which I hope we can return to, is this tension between the imperative of open public deliberation, which Sir David King had also signaled the importance of, and the simple imperatives of decision-making in an emergency, which often require fast decisions, but also ones sometimes made in confidence and privately without those opportunities for public discussion. I think that's a really important tension to note. And the other quick one I'd footnote is the reference to the tension between bioethics as ethics, understood in its full rich academic sense, and as politics. And I can't help but note that those of you who read the Sunday Serious papers will have seen some of the commentary on the work of John Bew, who is now Boris Johnson's foreign policy advisor, and whose academic book on realpolitik is proving hugely influential amongst some people. And one of the 4 principles of realpolitik is, doesn't matter whether what people believe is ethical, what matters is simply that they believe it is. So it's the reality of ethical judgments that does a lot of the political work. So I'm going to move on to Dominic, and I hope we can return to some of the panel will return to some of the issues Jonathan raised in due course. Dominic also will be very well known to you as Professor of Medical Ethics and Director of Medical Ethics at the Oxford Hero Centre for Practical Ethics, but also a consultant neonatologist at the John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford. But he has been a prolific commentator and writer on all the various issues that have arisen during this pandemic, and I'm delighted he can be our second speaker today. So over to you, Dominic.
Good, and I'm hoping I was struggling with my mute button, but I seem to have managed to unmute myself, or somebody's unmuted me. Thank you very much if you did. Excellent. So it's great to follow on from Jonathan. I'm going to zoom into a specific issue that Jonathan's already highlighted would overlap between our talks, which was about ethical guidance in relation to triage and intensive care. It was an intense focus of bioethical debate in the early stages of the pandemic. And I want to look at both this general question about whether or when ethical guidance is ethical, and the specific question about whether the ethical guidance that was in place or proposed was ethical. So I'm going to start off by setting out why we might want to have pandemic triage guidance. I'll also raise but reject some of the arguments against having such triage guidance. I'll focus in particular on what limited guidance there was, and on the hypothetical mere guidance, which, as Jonathan's highlighted, didn't end up being rolled out. And I want to look at some of the evidence that I've contributed to, that we've been working on, in thinking about some of the ethical challenges that there were, or the questions that were raised about that guidance at the time, not so much about the politics, but about the ethics of that guidance. And as I'll point out, as will become apparent, the answers to those questions have come, but they've come sort of between 6 months, 12 months, 18 months too late. So I think then that leads on to this question about, well, what could we do next time to address specifically the question that Dave highlighted? Well, how do we get the advice that we need at the time when we need it? Because it clearly didn't happen this time. So why do we need guidance around triage? So for those who aren't aware, just so everyone's familiar, this is the idea that if intensive care units were overwhelmed, that there would be guidance telling clinicians how to decide which patients to admit to intensive care. That the specific drivers for this becoming both in the public mind and the mind of politicians and ethicists really rose at the beginning of March last year in the wake of the experience in northern Italy. There's some interesting kind of conflicting accounts about whether or not rationing occurred. There are some who were saying it was definitely occurring. They were not admitting patients of a certain age to their intensive care units. Others making the claim that rationing didn't occur and that there was never any rationing. Regardless, there was real concern that that was a possibility. And I think there are kind of 4 basic ethical reasons why such guidance might be valuable. One is in terms of the consistency of decision making. So we're all familiar with the concerns about postcode lotteries in decision making in relation to all sorts of medical decisions. And one of the things that the NHS aspires to do is to have national guidance when it comes to treatment decision. Now, there isn't always a nationally consistent approach to allocation of resources, and there are postcode lotteries, for example, in relation to IVF. But in general, we aim to have a consistent approach, and certainly when it comes to something as serious as triage in a pandemic, we might well think that it would be crucial for there to be consistency. Secondly, there was a particular feeling about the need to have something that could be used, Jonathan referred to, in the middle of the night. And I think that's a very real, very important practical consideration. As somebody who works in the middle of the night and who's on call in the middle of the night with clinicians making difficult decisions about escalation of treatment, you have to have something that people can use. And a long, complicated either process or document that talks in detail about the ethical principles and competing considerations has definite value, but isn't going to be something that doctors can use in the middle of the night, that can use quickly. And these decisions do have to be made potentially in very short spaces of time. Thirdly, a reason to have such guidance is to ensure that it's being made on the basis of the right sorts of criteria. So that there's, of course, a question then about what those criteria are. But if you haven't got such guidance, then the possibility is that people are making guidance on the basis of the wrong sorts of considerations, whether that's age, if we think age is not relevant, or whether it's based on other sorts of biases that we know influence decisions both of clinicians and others. And fourthly, and significantly, and this was a real issue for the clinicians who were working in intensive care at the time, this was something that they were feeling they needed because of what they feared they would have to do and the distress that they anticipated and many of them experienced in making decisions. It relates to that, the psychological burden and burnout associated with making particularly repeated kind of end-of-life decisions leading to death of patients, and concern about the legal vulnerability of those clinicians, and that was again a recurring theme in clinicians' minds. But there were arguments against having some such guidance, as has been alluded already. There was a judicial appeal criticizing the failure to produce national guidance, and there are a variety of legal arguments that were given in that particular judgment, which didn't find that the government's decision was irrational. That was a fairly low bar to perhaps cross, but the arguments, the political arguments, was that with all the Nightingale hospitals, it was unnecessary. Perhaps it was unnecessary or undesirable because actually these decisions should be made by individual clinicians who could be sensitive to all the relevant characteristics, or it could be devolved to hospitals and clinical ethics committees to do it. I think that certainly raises these concerns about consistency of decision making. There were political concerns about whether such guidance would be accepted by the public. and a feeling that this was just too much of a hot potato. Oh, the Dad's Army picture here. This was to remind me about my kind of slightly wry, as a chair of a clinical ethics committee, reflection on the UK model of clinical ethics, that we have a Dad's Army approach to clinical ethics in the UK, and the idea that our informal, often variably qualified, unresourced clinical ethics committees could rise to this occasion and serve this sort of function just seems interesting. Okay. So what guidance am I talking about? Well, yes, indeed. What guidance? Back in the early months of the first half of last year, we both had a surfeit of guidance coming from all sorts of different places, both individual ethicists and groups of ethicists and professional bodies of various kinds, the BMA, the RACP, the NICE, Intensive Care Society, and a lack of national guidance. So you simultaneously, and the former, in a sense, arose from the latter, because the lack of national guidance led people to feel that they had to do something, because there wasn't something national coming. There were some national guidelines. I mentioned NICE already. That NICE guidance, such as it was produced very early on, referred to in a somewhat vague way the idea that clinical frailty should be assessed, and then there was a suggestion that had some impact. There was some import for decisions about triage admission to intensive care, though in a very non-specific way. The guidance was clearly written, perhaps with an eye to either public sensitivity or legal appeal. So it didn't say that people who had a certain score shouldn't go to intensive care. It talked about considerations. But it drew a line on this scale, which is used for assessing patients' clinical frailty, between those who have milder degrees of clinical frailty, who have minimal degrees of clinical frailty, and those who are mildly frail. But the line at which the line was drawn was relatively low down. Mild frailty includes a large number of older individuals who are independently living, even if they're needing some support in the community. So that in itself was interesting. As Jonathan's mentioned, the MEAG and Intensive Care Society were working furiously. A number of us were aware behind the scenes that this was potentially coming, and they came up with some provisional guidance based on a tool that clinicians had worked on, which combined a range of ethical considerations, including that were relevant for the chance of dying from COVID, the patient's age, their degree of clinical frailty, their number of underlying comorbidities, and on that basis separated patients into different groups. They included, interestingly enough, relevantly, but potentially controversially, if it had ever come live, a discount for females who would have ended up with a lower score by 1 mark. But as Jonathan's already mentioned, this tool didn't emerge. The New York Times broke the story at the beginning of April. The Financial Times later leaked the tool itself, but it was never used. And as we've already alluded to, some of the political and possibly ethical reasons given for it not being used. So how should we have made these decisions if they had been required, which by and large in the UK they weren't, thankfully, though they were in other parts of the world? Well, I think that there were a number of questions. I'm going to just focus on 3 questions arising from the NICE and MEAG guidance, which I've thought about over the ensuing year, 12 months or so. So one is whether it's justified to distinguish between patients on the ground on the basis of frailty. Second, this question that several speakers have already alluded to this morning about public support for such guidance. And third, there was very limited evidence at the time about how such guide tools would work. So I'll just allude to some evidence on how these tools might have worked, or did work, or could have worked. So frailty is a well-described concept that comes from geriatrics. It's the idea of a kind of global understanding of loss of homeostatic reserve that comes with increasing age. We're very familiar with the concept, and geriatricians think of it as it's not a specific diagnosis, but it's a way of understanding a process that is common to all of us if we get old enough. And for a number of years, intensivists in particular have been looking at the relationship between this characteristic and outcome in intensive care, because of their concern that those patients who are very frail are much less likely to survive from intensive care. And this sort of data from the study called VIPS, which is the Very Old Intensive Care Patients Study, looking at the relationship for emergency admissions, the linear relationship between mortality and the frailty scale. At the highest end of the frailty scale, there's 60% or almost 80% mortality. One thing to point out is frailty is not the same as futility. So even at the very highest end, patients with a pre-existing terminal illness going to die in the next 6 months, if they're admitted to intensive care, there are a proportion of them who nevertheless survive. And in the paper that I have published in American Journal of Bioethics at the end of last year, I looked at the different ways in which frailty might be relevant for a triage decision, its relationship with the probability of survival if intensive care is provided, the duration of survival in terms of the number of life years that an individual might live. So those who are more clinically frail have a lower life expectancy, their quality of life subsequently. So it's also related with the chance of somebody being able to return to their home to be functionally independent after intensive care. But it's not related to one consideration which has been highly relevant, but often under-recognized in the public debate, which is the duration of requiring intensive care. And in the paper, I also explore some of the questions, and I'm not going to go into them now for reason of time, related to discrimination on the basis of age or disability, or its coincidence with sociodemographic or other forms of inequality. And in that paper, I think there are good reasons to think that it can be a justifiable criterion, but that we ought to be explicit in the way that NICE is not, and in a way that I wasn't sure that MEAG was, about why it is and where it is justified to use frailty. One of the interesting things about this coincidence of different ethical factors is that some of these are more controversial than others. So quality of life and duration of survival are more controversial than probability of survival and whether or not somebody will survive. So because frailty predicts each of these, people can pick and choose which one of these they claim is ethically relevant, even if it's a convenient truth that it predicts some of these others. So I think it's important to be explicit about which of these are ethically justified. I think that it should be applied consistently. One of the interesting things about the judicial review of the NICE guidance was that it was then restricted to a particular age group, which wasn't itself ageist. And in the paper, I proposed something that I won't explore now, which is the idea that this should be more give rise to a more broad concept of triage equivalence. What about public support? Well, Jonathan's pointed to some of the evidence and from the public about what the public would support in terms of triage guidance. This was a study that we published in December 2020 with over 750 members of the general public, putting them in the position of a clinician having to make decisions about intensive care for patients with COVID, giving them a range of factors and asking them, well, would you choose these patients based on these different considerations? And they were very consistent. A large proportion of those who we surveyed would prioritize a patient with a higher chance of survival, a patient who would live for a longer period of time, who would require a shorter period of time in intensive care. We contextualize that by saying, if somebody needs a shorter period of intensive care, you can treat more patients if your resource is very scarce. Somebody who's younger, independent of duration of survival, somebody who's less frail. So these were all factors that were built into the MIA guidance, and it looked like at least when we framed the questions in the way that we did, that there was a lot of public support for that. We also asked about a controversial question that I won't go into now, about their support for withdrawal of intensive care on the grounds of limited resources. This is data that isn't published, that Jonathan might be interested in. In a separate survey that we did in June last year, we asked 500 members of the UK public whether they agreed that it would be ethical for doctors to follow the NICE guidance if they had to. And we explained what the NICE guidance said in terms of distinguishing patients who are more frail from those. And there was a strong support that it would be ethical for doctors to follow that guidance. We gave them a picture of the MIA guidance, explained how it differed, and we got an almost identical degree of support for the MIA guidance. So a little bit of it of support for the idea that the public, at least superficially, thought that these sorts of guidance were ethical. And very briefly, we audited in the first wave of the pandemic at a time when actually capacity locally in Oxford was not exceeded, but these tools were not being used, or at least the MIA tool was not being used, but the NICE tool in terms of measurement of clinical frailty was being used. Whether the MIA tool would actually have predicted survival from intensive care, and whether it coincided with the decisions that clinicians were making. And this study, which will be out in Wellcome Open Research very shortly, identified that this tool was more predictive of decisions to admit to intensive care than the clinical frailty scale alone or age alone. It wasn't very strongly predictive of mortality, though it has not unsurprisingly associated with mortality. So what should we do next time? Well, I think this problem of timing, the problem of the great difficulty that Jonathan's very carefully explained of arriving at the right sort of guidance in the time that we need, the problems of engaging with the public, means that we have to do it in advance. I don't think there's any alternative to that. If we want to engage the public, we need to do it in advance. And I think it's possible to do that. So in Maryland, over a number of years, along doing the sorts of pandemic influenza preparation that the UK had done, they had very meaningful a series of workshops engaging the public, talking about different ethical values. So a real exercise in deliberative democracy that was then used to inform some of the guidance, the Pittsburgh guidance, which was influential in some parts of the States. So I think there's a really important model there for how we could use public engagement to develop quite specific resource allocation guidance. I think politically, there's a huge advantage in doing that in advance, because it's much easier for politicians to sign up to something that they're not actually having to implement. It's going to be kicked down the road. Somebody else is going to actually have to use. And of course, at the time, it's easier for somebody else to say, well, it's already been agreed. And then they can blame their predecessors for the actual guidance. So because of the advantages of this sort of buck passing, it actually makes it possible politically to arrive at something that, of course, in the heat of the moment, is much more challenging to arrive at. So I'm going to wind up there. Apologies, I think I've probably gone over time. I think the ethical guidance that was proposed, the ethical suggestion by NICE that frailty was relevant, these were ethically relevant criteria, that they would have been endorsed by the public, though of course we could only find that out in retrospect and far too late. It looked like they were potentially empirically sound, but again, we could only find that out a long way down the track. And I'm going to stop there.
Thank you very much indeed, Dominic. I thought that was an extremely helpful, clear, wide-ranging review of how ethical guidance might work in one particular area of crucial decision-making. I note again that you raised the issue of ethical preparedness and the extent to which we should not be surprised if certain issues suddenly come up, and nevertheless how far we're often blindsided. And it does seem to me worthy of note that we've been in a pandemic for 18 months and you might have seen certain issues coming down the road. But if you take even something like vaccine passports, it seemed to take everyone by surprise that this might be an issue we need to have some discussion of and public deliberation of. And one more, we're now talking, as I'm fully aware, of the question of whether there is such a thing as an acceptable level of death once we return to the new normal. That again seemed to take everybody surprised. Here's an issue we really should be addressing, and yet it was leaked out in various ways without any ample discussion. So there does seem to be something we're doing wrong in the UK when we try to stimulate a full and helpful ethical discussion of issues. We have ample opportunity now for Q&A and for discussion. Could I encourage those who are, I was going to say mere attendees, those who are attending but who'd like to ask a question of any of the speakers, if they could do so in the Q&A and make it clear who they're addressing the question to. Otherwise, I'm going to open it up to our panelists. But I think before I do that, I ought to just give Jonathan an opportunity to respond, if he wishes, to any critical points that were made by Dominic in his talk.
Dave, thank you. I'm not sure critical. I mean, we should probably disclose that Dominic and I had extensive discussions over this going on. I chair the trust in which he's a consultant, you know, and I had a strong interest in the work that he was doing, and I used his counsel when I was trying to do the MEAG work. There are just 3 points I thought would be worth observing. One is a point of slightly different recollection, and it's the chicken and egg question about what prompted the work for MEAG. Was it and the multiple guidance? Now, my recollection is that one of the things that prompted the MEAG work was the fact that loads of people were already producing guidance, and there was a sense in which it would be helpful to have a single guidance as opposed to the sort of vacuum problem that prompted the extra work. I'm reasonably confident of that view, but one of the illustrations, I think, you know, which might help us think about it in a sort of slogan sort of way, is that we did quite a lot of diplomacy as we were trying to secure a MEAG support and government support between lots of other people already working on it. And we had a Tolkien sort of motto that we were trying to get one guidance to rule them all, because we saw that there would be a lot of value in the terms that Dominic identified if actually the government sponsored something. So it was a messy situation. Lots of people knew that we needed it, but it proved to be pretty difficult to deliver it. Why did it prove to be difficult to deliver it? So second point, and relates to ethical preparedness. When I spoke about this to the German National Ethics Committee, someone put in the chat the Mike Tyson quote: "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face." You know, and one of the interesting questions about the whole preparedness approach, I think, is could we ever expect governments to work that way? You know, so I'm not saying we shouldn't prepare. We should, of course, prepare, but we may have to face up to the fact that when it gets really difficult, governments behave unpredictably, and there may have been nothing we could have done to secure this. And if you look internationally, we were thought to be the second best prepared country in the world for a pandemic, and the best prepared country was the United States of America. And you can you can draw quite a lot of conclusions about ethical preparedness from that. The third thing I'd just like to say, and the last thing, is just a bit of clarity, which I didn't say, about what was in my head when we were trying to design the MEAG guidance. And I always thought that what we needed was a sort of data committee in the way that a trial would have it. So that tool that we put out in that document, what we anticipated was it would be constantly revised. So if you've got this framework in place, we would be always asking, what is the best available evidence? So we weren't thinking that scoring tool would last very long. We were thinking that if you establish the importance of having one, you could then refine it. And we could find out, as Dominic's been doing work, whether those things were or were they not predictive. But the idea was that if you got a decision-making structure in place, you could refine it. But if you didn't have anything in place, it would remain the Wild West. So that was those are elements of response. None of that will be a surprise to Dom, because we've had these discussions previously, but it might open up some lines of inquiry for us all. Thanks, Dave.
Right, brilliant. Thanks very much, Jonathan. I see there's a question in the Q&A, which I think was echoing my comment about acceptable deaths. So we might come back to that, but I'm going to ask panelists to make comments, ask questions, and if I could ask them to do so by indicating a raised hand, which is in the participants toolbar. But there is already someone. Emily, you're on my list.
Thank you. Thank you for two fantastic talks. I've learned a huge amount. I had two questions, really. The first is to do with having prospective guidance, sort of getting ready for the next time now. And I wondered whether you could maybe either or both of you say something about, it's not just that we need to prepare in terms of the content of that guidance, of what it would say, because of the points that Jonathan just made, that the next pandemic may be different and the guidance that's produced now might be ignored. But I wondered whether we have the right structures in place, the right organisations. If this happens again in 5 years' time, who do we go to? Who's going to be doing this? And have we got, in a sense, the process and the organisational structure there to produce this sort of guidance quickly, and with all of the sort of defensibility, etc., that you would want from it? So that was the first question. The second question is just something about the discussions about who gets the ventilator and what are we going to do when we run out of ventilators. And one worry I have a bit about this, and I think maybe some public education needs to happen at the same time, is the implication that gives to people is that being admitted to an ICU, being on ventilation, is always a good thing and always works and is always sort of super desirable if you're very ill. And I wonder whether at the same time as obviously we need triage for ventilation in this sort of scenario, whether there's also a public education piece of work to do about making sure people understand about some of the downsides of ventilation, and that at the end of life it can be not great for people, so that people don't see it as this scarce and therefore hugely desirable good. Thank you.
Fantastic. And I was going to suggest that perhaps the first question is one that Jonathan might like to take the lead on, and the second question Dominic might want to respond to, but without ruling out either of you answering both.
Let me go first, Dave. I had a question for Emily, which I'd like to ask as well, so I'll perhaps do that at the end, and she can think about it. So I think, what do I reflect on this? I think we need to think a lot about our people resources going into it. And I would think that is more important in some way than the organisations. So there is a small number of people who have had a lot of opportunities to bend people's ear in this, and many of them are on this panel and call, and that's not healthy because it risks groupthink. So I think we need to ask ourselves, do we have the diversity of voices in this area that people will identify? And there's some work, I think, Dave, that you're involved with the council and UKRI, sort of trying to map this. I think that's really important, because I think we have a lot more resource than we've deployed. The second point I'd make is about organisations, is that I think one of my reflections from this, which I would not have anticipated prior to COVID, is the differences between government and non-government activities. So I think Nuffield Council's done a fantastic job of doing the sort of things that if you'd asked me in advance, I would have thought a body like MEAG should have done. But we couldn't do that because we had to dovetail our agenda with the political agenda, and we had to only do things we were asked to do. We could lobby to do things, but we couldn't make it. And I think the legal risks of producing guidance are much greater than I anticipated they were. So I think as we go forward, we can't reasonably expect government to do some of these hard things. I think they will always find it too hard, and they will always be open to legal scrutiny. And so we need to think about a sort of ecology of organizations and not think that a national ethics committee is a thing, but a network of groups with different roles, because I'm completely sold on the benefit of government having access to confidential private advice, but absolutely not at the expense of there being proper public debate. So how do we get both? And the question for you, Emily, is around the COVID guidance. I'd be really interested in your reflections on the Liverpool Care Pathway, because I'm been mulling over whether or not guidance does produce consistency or whether it produces sort of mechanical approaches, and whether we're right in the thought that guidance would actually make us more ethical, or whether actually that requires a bit of reflection. And I just wonder whether your experience of reviewing what happened with the Liverpool Care Pathway could be fed into this discussion. That's all from me at the moment, Dave.
Thank you, Jonathan. And just to confirm, yes, indeed, the Nuffield is conducting a project with UKRI to investigate and scope and map what is an incredibly convoluted and complex landscape of bioethical advice and regulation. It contrasts the UK very markedly with what you might say in Germany or France. So the Deutsche Ethikrat is quite capable of providing a single voice to the federal government in Germany, because it is the only ethics body, and that has obvious risks and problems attached to it. Dom,
although interesting, Dave, if you talk to Elena at our first seminar,
yeah,
she pulled out some of the problems they were faced by being forced to say something before they were really ready. It's interesting.
It is, and equally, she will probably concede privately that they are a political body in some ways that are good and some ways that are actually bad because they're appointees. Dom, do you want to answer Emily's second question about being cautionary about the good of continued existence on the ventilator?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a really important point that was addressed by a number of people at early stages. There were quite a lot of intensivists who were talking actively about the fact that intensive care was not always a good. I think there was also some important and valuable public education early on about the importance of advanced care planning, people thinking about what their wishes might be if they were to become seriously ill. I'm not totally sure how much that was taken up. I think there's an interesting piece of public education that was completely absent, which is an honest reflection of the fact that in our NHS, rationing in intensive care occurs all the time. And I found there was some slightly inaccurate statements by intensivists claiming that they always make decisions in the best interest of the patient in front of them, which I think is not an accurate reflection of the nature of triage. I think there is that sort of resource allocation clearly occurs, but it's still sensitive both amongst the medical community and the wider community. It's a form of rationing that people don't like to talk about. So there was a question in the chat about the 2007 pandemic flu guidance and how often guidance would need to be revisited. And I think that there's, in a sense, that the Maryland experience was a kind of useful in that it pointed to the nature of the public values and how the public traded off and weighed up different values, what they thought ought to go into a policy. But clearly, the specifics of a framework are going to depend upon the nature of the agent that you're dealing with. Are you dealing with something that, like COVID, has its impact across the lifespan, but particularly in the elderly, or something that was part of some of the models that might have an inverse mortality approach? So some of those, if you can get public input and some agreement on the ethical principles, then you can adapt that to potentially to a new problem.
Thanks very much. I the panelists are earning their right to lunch by lining up very impressively. So I'm going to ensure that I get everybody in who's there and who's raised a hand. I think, Jonathan, you're first.
Great, thank you very much, and a fantastic session. So one comment and one question. My comment was about why we have been so unprepared ethically. And it took me to thinking about my children's lessons at school on ethics. And I was struck how they are prepared to answer questions on what's the right thing for me to do in this situation, but had no tools to answer questions about how should society respond to this issue. So they're well equipped to answer, is it moral to have an abortion, but had no tools to answer, how should society regulate abortion? And I think a similar point in relation to health, that there's plenty of stuff online to teach you how to be a healthy individual, but ideas of what makes a healthy society or a healthy community, those are questions that just have not been discussed. And that, I think, is in part why, just in terms of the sort of public conversations, people were ill-equipped to deal with the pandemic. And then a question on guidance for triage. What I think many people do not like is being categorized and put in a box. You are a 50-year-old who has this condition and therefore this happens to you. And I think many people instinctively rebel against all of those categorizations. And I suppose it's the difficulty of how can we come up with triage guidance that avoids people feeling they're being put into certain kinds of boxes and limited in that way. Thank you.
Unless Jonathan or Dominic wants to respond immediately to that, I suggest they take a couple more questions from panelists and then see how we run. So next on my list was John Coggon.
Hi, thank you, Dave and Jonathan and Dominic. Just a sort of brief comment, and then I got two questions which I think I would pose to Jonathan, but would be pleased to hear what Dominic thinks too. Just the comment, I think when we're thinking this through, we're sort of talking about ethics, but ethics means different things in different contexts, even under the headings of what we're discussing today. And I think if we're going to unpick the problems of who and how, we probably need more specific categorizations of what we're actually alighting on. And I think related to that, the headline kind of question is about national ethical guidance, but within the sub questions that have been addressed throughout this excellent series that Dave and Emma have coordinated, there's been questions of who should do so, with reference essentially to what would make authoritative guidance, and national and authoritative don't necessarily go hand in hand. In two ways, we got these questions of subsidiarity that Dave mentioned at the start, but also, for example, the Nuffield Council, on which I sit, could claim to issue national guidance, but there are many people who would say, well, does that make it authoritative? So it matters who issues particular points of guidance in particular instances, and so that those two broad points broadly capture, I think, what I tried to convey in my earlier contribution within the series, but they lead to the questions to Jonathan. So the first is the idea of the threat of legal scrutiny. And I think in particular here we're thinking of judicial review, such as the case to which Dominic referred. I wonder why you consider that to be such a problematic threat, as opposed to just a part of ongoing scrutiny that should perhaps be welcomed, rather than a reason not to issue the guidance in the first place. And you can highlight past failures, but there may also be successes, and they might be harder to highlight because a judicial review might not be brought unless there's very evidently a problem. And Dominic talked about irrationality. I think you refer to it as being a low bar, but in public law terms, it's an extremely high bar for the judges to sort of weigh in on the quality of the decision. So I'm not sure it's a terribly potent threat. I think if we were to rely just on judicial review against executive action in our checks and balances, we'd not be too happy about that. And then the second question, Jonathan, I was interested in the framing around real politics and so on. And I think even within your analysis, there are points on which it is appropriate that it be the government that issue the guidance. So this greater diffusion of responsibility for it, I agree with, but there are some points where it really ought to be the government that does it. I'm interested there in how we identify those questions that are apt for government guidance, and possibly the last part of this, which may be more depressing, is how we can make that happen. Because I don't think we can rely on the courts. I don't think we can push aside the real political context that might make questions be ones that people don't want to air. And then a vacuum does form after all, which it won't be possible to fill, it seems to me. So thank you for that.
Jonathan, do you want to answer those 2 points before I move on?
I'll have a start, Dave, and John and I already had some conversations about this. So let me start by sort of saying what I think I'm strongly claiming. And I think what I'm strongly claiming is a descriptive point that I believe, and I believe I'm pretty firm in my belief on this, that currently there is a nervousness about being judicial reviewed, which means that in a context where if you issue guidance, you're likely to get judicially reviewed, and if you don't, you leave it to somebody else, you're not, then that creates an incentive on governments not to get involved. And I'm absolutely confident that that is part of the picture that we're grappling with. Now, that's not the same as saying that we should put up with that and that we shouldn't challenge it. And I mentioned in relation to the SAGE paper, the sort of feeding in the idea of equality impact assessments, which is exactly a tool for trying to get governments to think those things through instead of being judicially reviewed, but to do it in advance and avoid it. So I'm not making, there's a weaker claim I'm making, but it's still one I want to hold open to make, and I will continue debating it, which is whether actually there is a malign effect of legal scrutiny. And my reasons for wanting to keep open that weaker claim is that if you just look at some of the literature around the human rights that were said to be at stake in this, you can see that we would be able to debate different approaches for a very long time, and that it'd be very hard for a government to be confident that a position which they thought was legally sound would be immune from at least a judicial review getting started. And I think that's a deeper problem. And one of the solutions to that is to create a legal authority to issue guidance, and some foundations for that, which would enable you to say, this is a case where we're not waiting for the courts, we're trying to do something in advance. So I think there's a very strong claim, which is we understand the context in which we're dealing with. One of those contexts is that people were put off formulating guidance because of the worry of judicial review. And that's also true of the professional guidance. So the internal exchanges of emails around the ICS, and I'm sure you'll have seen in other places, about can we use this guidance? Are we going to be exposing ourselves to judicial action if we do this? If someone operates on this guidance, will they be then accused of corporate manslaughter because they've allowed someone to die? Those things are real in terms of worries. They're not necessarily real in terms of probability. So I think we need to face up to that. So there's a strong claim, which is this has been part of the context, in the same way as I think part of our context is an attack on expertise. It's a development of social media activity, which meant that what we planned for in 2007 was not the same as the event that we're dealing with. But those are not things to give up on. I do think, though, that we do need to continue to talk about whether or not the legal intervention is constructive or not. And as you know, that's a continuing interest. But I won't say more now, Dave, because that will block off the other questions.
I did before. There's two questions waiting, but I did want not to let Jonathan's interesting comment go unanswered, and just give Jonathan and Dominic a chance if they wish to respond to it, which was the there could be a measure of ethical literacy amongst young people, and they'd be perfectly capable of giving you a good answer to the question of whether or not abortion is morally permissible, but they would be utterly incapable of giving you an answer to the question as, well, how do I change the law? How do I influence policy? And how does policy and law relate to my ethical understanding of the issues? So there does seem to be an incredible democratic shortfall in some ways in the UK. People just don't feel that there's any space in which they can contribute to these kinds of discussions, even if they feel competent to make an ethical judgment on the matter. So,
yeah. So I mean, Jonathan raised two points.
Are we unique in that? Are we different in that? Is it better in liberal democracies?
I mean, one of the things just to highlight, and it's like the elephant in the room, but we haven't mentioned the fact that we have probably not unique, but we have a political leadership that is strikingly afraid of open, nuanced debate about a whole range of things. That is afraid of making difficult decisions for the right sorts of reasons. And I think part of the reason why we haven't had public debate about the ethics of making different decisions in the context of the pandemic is because of the absence of political leadership or the particular nature of the leaders that we have in power. So I think there is, of course, a wider issue about ethical literacy and democracy, and of course, as ethicists and educators, we all have a role to play in that. And if I think that's an important one. There was a separate question that Jonathan raised, which is about putting people in boxes, and I think it's an interesting. There is a huge tension. Jonathan Montgomery, I think, has commented that in vaccination, that was seen to be less of a threat than in relation to triage. It's interesting to reflect that the previous pandemic guidance used illness severity scores as its preferred means of passing out, and illness severity scores have been criticised in the context of flu as an imperfect predictor, which also might, in the same way as some of the MEAG scores, coincide with certain types of social inequalities. There are criticisms of those, but one advantage of those is that they avoid this kind of box characterization of people. People don't see themselves as having those acute illness severity scores. So that's a virtue of them. I think it's a funny sort of virtue in that it just kind of hides the ethical factor, or it hides people from thinking that it's going to apply to them, where of course it may. And I just wanted to raise something that I didn't talk about, but my slides alluded to, because I talked about it in my previous talk, which is about the general scylla and charybdis of guideline writing. That on one side, you can produce guidance that's extremely easy to apply in the middle of the night because it's very specific. But at the cost of ignoring other relevant characteristics, and of course being accused of being arbitrary in the way that the MEAG guidance, if it had been used, would have been accused. So the MEAG, it definitely has some scylla characteristics. The opposite extreme is charybdis, where you make some very some nice sounding statements that everybody can agree with about capacity for benefit. For example, triage should be on the basis of choosing those patients who have the greatest capacity to benefit, which everybody can say, oh, that sounds wonderful, but is completely useless in the middle of the night and doesn't help anybody. And you've got to somehow navigate between the two. But of course, in the Greek myth, it was impossible. You couldn't safely sail out of the reach of the whirlpool and out of the reach of the monster.
I forbear commenting that allusions to Greek myths sit uncomfortably with the character of the current Prime Minister, but we'll let that one pass. There's a very good question in the chat, which from Sharon, which is a point about the sheer diversity and plurality of organisations giving ethical guidance. So we're all aware that in March last year, there was advice from NICE, from MEAG, from BMA, from Royal Colleges. And if there is a question here, which hopefully the Nuffield UKRI project will try and address, is whether the sheer plurality and diversity of organisation providing guidance does represent a real obstacle to clear, authoritative and decisive guidance. But I'll let that one, as it were, sit with the two speakers, because I want to bring in the other panelists who have questions. And Peter, you were next on my list, and then
thank you. I think I've probably got two observations and leading to a question. But my first observation was linked to Jonathan's debate around centralized guidance versus the usefulness of local guidance, because having had an interest in prioritization for many years, I was, as I'm sure many of us were, roped into providing guidance at the local level. And I think Jonathan may be aware that there's certainly a black market at that time of all draft documents that were being produced by national documents that were being incorporated into local guidance. And I think one of my main job was to point out and take out some of the more controversial guidance that was obviously a draft document. But the practical issue was that at that time, the concentration was very much on triage and ventilators and acute. But we soon realized that actually the guidance was needed outside that area. There was a tendency for non-referral into secondary care. Local practitioners were making their own decisions. And in fact, the guidance that we produced locally was not around triage. It was around appropriate transfer from social care, community care into the hospital in the first place. The second observation is, and absolutely crucial, is Jonathan's point that he didn't expect the guidance to be there and to be set in stone. It had to be a process of reiteration. And certainly my experience 12 years at NICE, I hasten to add, I wasn't around NICE when it produced its pandemic guidance. But it has to be a process. So you need an ongoing process. You can't set up a committee to produce a guidance and then disappear. There has to be a fundamental system in place. And I suppose that leads to my final question, really. There will be, and it continues to be, extensive reviews of how we've performed in the pandemic. Will the world of bioethics be there, laying out exactly what it should be presenting to this committee, and how all the debates and the arguments and fruitful discussions that have been had can actually then impact in a practical way. And then a final observation, I think Dominic mentioned, it's as if the word rationing prioritization had never existed before the pandemic. And nearly 21 years experience of NICE seemed to disappear. And that was around the rhetoric, and that was purely political. I mean, there was no talk about value for money or cost effectiveness. It was about, we do what it takes. And I think that pervaded the whole debate. Thank you.
Fantastic, Peter. Thanks very much. I think what I might do is, Jonathan has had his hand up, and I'll ask him to make his comments and questions, and then come back to others, pick up on a couple of interesting points that have been made there. Jonathan.
Thanks, David. Thanks to both speakers. We've got lots and lots of observations I'd love to make, but I'll limit myself to two linked questions, if I may. One for Jonathan and one to Dom. And for they're both around really the question of who gets a seat at the table and who should be involved in developing and giving this advice. And I guess there's both Jonathan and Dom presented two different ways of getting people involved, and both kind of potentially problematic. And I guess for Jonathan, my question was, how do you go about deciding who is on MEAG and who you ask? And I was struck by the membership of MEAG about how many members there were who were clearly from religious faith groups compared to kind of academic bioethicists. And I'm not suggesting that academics are the best people to do this, but I think there was lots and lots of religious involvement. And I was wondering, kind of, is that because of the assumption religious leaders are more moral, or are just good people, or but is it hark back to the early days of bioethics, where theology was such a key player. I guess I'm just curious about the thinking behind the composition of that group. And for Dominic, the related question relates to your survey data and work that you presented. I think there's certainly always a value in getting public perspectives on what they find acceptable. But I was curious about whether you felt those kind of data were more politically useful or useful for bioethics, because certainly governments might find it useful to know if people approve of guidance, but people agreeing isn't necessarily a good indication that the position is good or that it's justified. So I wonder to what extent you think we should use those kinds of findings with caution, or whether we should, or how we can use them to decide what we ought to be doing and whether they confer any kind of justification.
I don't want to lose sight of Peter's questions, and I want to come back to a couple of things he raised there, but perhaps if I go backwards and ask Jonathan and then Dominic to answer Jonathan's two questions. Jonathan, there was a question about membership of MEAG, and then Dominic, there was a question about the status of the data.
So if I go, first of all, I can't tell you how that membership came about. It just happened. The context in which it happened was not COVID. The context was Brexit or EU exit preparations, and I think it was probably then driven partly by worries about supply chain resilience, and there was a bioethics element of what would we do if we found scarcity in relation to supplies of certain medicines. The body was also sat in emergency preparedness. It's now within the DHSC ethics domain, but it started off in emergency preparedness, and it sat not just in DHSC, but also in governments and community, local government communities. So my perception is that there were sort of two strands. The DHSC people came up with a group of names that they knew of, and the local government people came up with a group of names that they. So I think it's largely accidental. We have got agreement now that we should refresh the membership in terms of reference and actually ask ourselves that question. And then there'll be a tricky challenge about how you persuade some people not to carry on, or whether you just have a very big group. So that's a sort of historical question. I think the normative question, I think, is slightly different. So first of all, we found ourselves with a bit of a split in the group. There was a perception that certain types of issues, the inverted commas bioethicists took the lead on, and certain types of issues such as ritual practices around bodies, funeral rites, though that the community's representatives took a lead on. And we had that out in a sort of open discussion. We were picking up people saying they felt this, and actually once the air was cleared, it evened out much more. It wasn't my perception that actually there was much deference either way, that people seemed to be going in, but that was quite tricky virtually. It would have been easier face-to-face to establish that sort of sense of it. So I think it's largely accidental. I think it had its rocky elements of them thinking these things were different, but it then settled into just grappling with questions, and it's not so obvious who speaks on particular issues. Third point I'd make is that we got ourselves in I'd be careful because Sharon Burton's in the meeting on the chat. We got ourselves in a situation where the original group of names was slanted around people, but then it made it obvious that you had some regulators there and not others, some unions there and not others, and it seemed much better to bring more resource in than to argue about whether it should be there or not. So I think a lot of this was opportunistic. And the final point I think I'd make on that is I do think this is a question we should face up to. So one of the things that struck me when I joined the Human Genetics Commission was that we have a very secularized debate, which doesn't necessarily reflect the language that people use in their own lives to resolve things. So actually, I welcomed the greater involvement of the faith communities. I happen to be a person of faith myself, but I welcomed it not for that reason, but because I do think there's a bit of a separation between the sub-public discourse and the more natural community discourses, and we need to have bridges between those. So I saw that as an opportunity to reflect better the sorts of ethical and moral resources that people have used for themselves and connect that with the public discourse. And perhaps if I could partly answer Jonathan Herring's point, Dave, before I hand over to Dom, because I think that's pertinent, that the types of resources that we teach in ethics and in schools, is a subset, as Jonathan pointed out, of the resources that are there. But I don't think that's been entirely true of the COVID response. So, for example, you looked at the statement from the European Group on Ethics. They put forward that the fundamental starting point is what are our common values as a society and what do they imply for our response. And whether you like it or not, you could take the same view of the anti-mask protesters. So their view of society is that actually it's more important for people to be free to do what they like than it is to act in solidarity. And those do draw on types of resources that bioethics has tend to marginalize. So I do think this is a point where we should ask ourselves whether or not the way we framed things is holding us back as well as enabling us to focus on it. And that was partly why I made that point about data ethicists and bioethicists coming together on the contact tracing app, because it doesn't seem to me that a priori we should assume that one is better than the other. We need to be able to have a discussion about what we need. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I think that links to the point that Peter was making, and I'm going to, as to whether or not bioethics needs to conduct an inquest into what they did and didn't do, and what they need to do for any future emergencies or events. But Dom, did you want to answer the question about the status and significance of public consultation data?
Yeah, so great question, Jonathan. And I mean, it's kind of the central issue of empirical bioethics about the relevance of the views of the public for bioethical debate, and many on this panel and in the audience will be very familiar with the kind of often the question that's raised is, well, clearly ethics is not simply about settled by opinion polls, and the fact that people think a particular way doesn't mean that that's the right answer. So yes, clearly such data can be useful politically. It can be useful to bioethical debates, I think, in a range of different ways. One is because I think there are often some claims about what the public support or would support that are often just empirically have no basis at all, and it's worth testing them. So as an example, some data that I haven't published yet, but is coming soon, watch this space, is about the relevance of race in triage and vaccine allocation. What would the public think? How much weight would they give to prioritization on the basis of racial disadvantage? When you go and measure people's views, doesn't necessarily line up with what people say the public view would be. So I think that's relevant for bioethical debate. And then, I think there's, as Jonathan's alluded to, there is an important question about what the society's values are, so that there is both a democratic but also an ethical reason to want our approach to reflect the values of society. I think there's an open question about whether the sorts of surveys that I've done telling people, do you give the ventilator to this patient or that patient, really get at society's values in a kind of meaningful rather than superficial way. I think that's an important question, but I think it's relevant in that way. And then as a kind of wider question, what are we to do as a kind of process of reflective equilibrium? I think there is an important element of trying to understand what people's views are, responses are, then to look at the relationship at the ethical arguments and see where they line up and where they diverge. And where they line up, I think that at least gives us a reason to think, okay, well, that looks like potentially a way to go. And where they diverge, then of course, do we revise our ethics or do we go and educate the public? We have to choose.
Thanks, Dom. So it seems to me that all comments are actually coming towards this interesting set of questions that I think Peter was raising, which was that when it came to have a discussion on various issues, some of it seemed to come as an enormous surprise to everyone, and yet clearly a lot of this is long-standing. It's not as if people haven't been writing or thinking about many of these issues. So having it's just simply something we need to focus on now in the particular context of life after COVID. So there did seem to be a sense in which there was something of a discursive vacuum that we were facing. Just people didn't know how to start talking about these issues. But the other question Peter raised is, well, okay, now as we start to think about what our experience was for the last 18 months, were we really prepared and competent as principally academic bioethicists to make a meaningful contribution to what happened? And have we learned enough lessons so that we can prepare adequately for the next emergency? Jonathan, your hand is up, so you may want to now answer that question.
It was more, I think, it's the beginning of that question. We'll see where it takes us, Dave. I just wanted to reflect on whether it's really true that this is a problem about vacuum or whether it's a problem about context. So one of the challenges which I, and I'm sure lots of other people on this conference that have periodically had to grapple with through this is what you can say in public and what you can't. And the more close you get to decision making, the less free you are to say things in public. So around the contact tracing app, I was actually specifically asked not to do a Today program interview that I'd agreed to do. My view had been that the Ethics Advisory Board was to support internally ethical deliberation and also public deliberation, and we should try and share the sorts of questions we were asking, and that was not problematic in my view, because you weren't giving away decisions, you were just trying to help the public debate. But the particular time I was invited not to do that, was all about trying to get our advice past the Secretary of State, and the sense that if the media got interested in it, that it would become more difficult for the decisions that we wanted to be taken. So I think we need to think quite a lot about the particular media context in which we're operating. So if you take the COVID triage guidance that we've been talking about, my expectation was that we showed a mock-up, the slide that you've seen that the Financial Times had as part of a MEAG discussion, which was, I think, 5 days after we were invited to start working on it, which said this is the sort of thing we think should be part of the process. We were unable to progress that because we were immediately threatened with, well, this will play out in the media as age discrimination. So we couldn't actually have the debate which we thought we were initiating, which is, was it or was it not appropriate to have age as a factor in this prediction? Now, when we went back to 2007, there was some Canadian triage guidance which incorporated age, and we were able to have a quiet, confidential debate in SIAPI, looking at the paper and how it's produced, and we could find out from that age had not been in there originally because it was not thought to be an accurate predictor. They'd done a survey of clinicians. Clinicians said we want age in, and age had gone in simply because of professional opinion. And we could actually have had quite a nuanced debate about whether this was sensible or not. And I had in my mind that possibility, and I thought, well, all we're establishing at this point, if we need something a bit like this, and then we can review the data and we can have a debate and find out whether it's acceptable or not. But we couldn't do that because the moment we were getting into debate, we were threatened with, well, this will just play out on the front pages of the papers. And of course, it didn't play out on the front pages of the papers immediately, but it did the following July. And the book that's written on that Insight investigation that Dominic showed you a headline of, describes that meeting as having a whiff of Nazi Germany about it. Now, that's a context in which it's really difficult to have the sort of debate that we were trying to create. And one of the reasons that was given to me and attributed to some really senior people about why they were pulling the national guidance was that the future of socialized medicine was at stake, because it would play into the USA death panel's debate about the NHS prime function would be being to deny treatment. Now, those are contexts which I would never have imagined us linking together. And yet that was the position that some of us were dealing in. So I think that's something which you can't deny is there, but you can insulate people against, and you can say that the system has to recognize that for some people that's going to be a pressure. But how do you, through organizations like the Nuffield Council, make sure that that doesn't stifle the debate that needs to be had? But it is an important feature that we were facing in those months. And it may be related to the point that Dominic was making about the nature of our government, but it may be longer lasting than just this government, I suspect. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that was both frank and somewhat alarming, because I think it draws attention to I mean, I think there is an issue around the way in which the UK's media has treated the issues throughout the course of the pandemic, which has been.
Dave, you're breaking up a bit.
It's cause for worry, and that's the end of the British media. But they have asked some pretty, seems to be simplistic questions, and they've made some rather bold and unhelpful statements about what's going on.
And there's something, Dave, about what they're interested
something
in
that we have to suffer in the UK. There seems to be this. Jonathan, you're kind of breaking up for me.
Sorry, it must be my end. There was something very interesting about the fact that when I had the opportunity on the Today programme, the one I did do, to talk about the advice that the Ethics Advisory Board was giving on the contact tracing app, they didn't give me any chance to talk about the content of that advice. They just wanted to know whether we were telling the Secretary of State that he had to do what we said, and I ended up saying, well, it's what it says on the tin. We're an advisory board. So I think you're right that there's something we need to grapple with about what we should be saying makes it possible to have these debates. But I absolutely don't think that means that we should stop trying, because they're really important debates to have. Thank you.
Sure. We're coming towards the end of our 2 hours, and I saw Emily and then Dominic had their hands up. So Emily first.
Really briefly, but this is to go back to the question that Jonathan asked me about the Liverpool Care Pathway, and I was very struck by what you were just saying about the media, because clearly the media played a huge role there in announcing that people were being euthanized when clearly that was not what was happening. There were just two things I think that I would say about that experience. One was it's true that if you have something that is a bit like a tick box, you tick this and you've done the job, there's a danger that people who are overworked and stressed and perhaps undertrained are going to just tick the box and not think about an individualized assessment and individualized care. And I think that was what came out of the review there, that in fact, one of the things that was critical was leadership, because in places where staff were properly resourced, well motivated, well trained, that it wasn't being used as a substitute for good care. But in places where maybe staff were under a huge amount of pressure, there was a tendency to tick the box rather than think about the patient. But the second thing that I think came out of there, which maybe isn't necessarily so relevant here, was the important, but maybe is in some ways, is the importance about talking about dying. Because what was clear is the reason lots of families were very upset at what had happened to their families with Liverpool Care Pathway was just because they didn't appreciate, they hadn't understood that their family member was in the final days of life. So I think the importance of being able to talk about death and what happens and when it's near and what it involves is incredibly important, and perhaps of some relevance here as well.
Apologies if I've been breaking up. There may be difficulties with my broadband connection. Dominic, I had you with your hand up.
Yeah, so I was just going to pick up on the question about the media. So I'm going to make some two comments that look contradictory, but I think are not. So one is that the way that the media has at times wanted to polarize pro-con debates, sometimes in an unhelpful way. So the Observer on the weekend, Trish Greenhoff and I ended up being on either sides of a question about Freedom Day and opening up. Neither of us were told that this was what we were doing. We were asked to write something. They'd sort us out deliberately. They framed us in this particular way, and I think on the one hand, the media likes simple pro-con yes/no debates, and that obviously simplifies ethical discourse enormously. But on the other hand, my contradictory comment is to say that I think there's value in thinking about our pandemic response in having dissenting voices. And although there's a huge amount of value in having national guidance and a single voice, I think there's also definitely room, as we've seen with Independent Sage, for having non-government bodies providing a critical voice, particularly if they can be constructive, if they can provide a dissenting opinion. And I think actually that is one of the important roles of ethics in pandemic response, is being able to provide dissenting opinions so that the debates can be enriched in important ways, that people can see both sides, or perhaps more accurately, all the sides rather than necessarily both sides, and all the nuance.
That's very helpful, Don. I have to say the best interview I gave was to Al Jazeera. So sometimes you're a bit shamed by how bad we are in the UK. And my favorite anecdote, I'm sure Jonathan has one, Dom, you have one, is simply spending an hour talking to a producer to be texted later to say our main producer has decided ethics has to go, given the running time. And that just seems to be a terribly sad comment on the way in which we doing this in the UK tend to frame issues. I'm looking at the time. I'm aware that Emma and I are back with others at 2 o'clock when we'll be looking at the separate issue of CECs and localized ethics committees. And I want to give everyone an opportunity for a good break. So unless there are any burning comments or questions, I did want to thank everybody who was here. Our main speakers, Jonathan and Dominic, who I think were generous with their time and willingness to answer hard and difficult questions at times, and I really appreciate them doing that. It's gracious and generous. But thank everybody on the panel for their very thoughtful questions, which are enormously helpful to Emma and I. And I think this conference is proving a very fitting end to what has been a really stimulating and wonderful project that both of us have been involved with. So thank you all very much. We may see some of you again at 2 o'clock, but in the meantime, stay in contact. We have a project webpage, and we will update it. And if any of you feel moved to write a blog, please do so. There are some already up there, and we would appreciate that. But for now, thanks very much, and stay safe, and try and enjoy Freedom Day and your summer holidays. Bye.